Good morning. Welcome back again to this academic education channel on physiology. And the name of the channel is Physiology Edu Hub by Dr. Dilip Swain. Once again, I am here with a very important academic topic in physiology that is known as oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. Today's lecture is all around this. It is divided into two parts. One is known as the introductory part, today I will complete, and the next video is on the aspects, that is clinical, physiological and applied aspects of this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Students, while you are reading the respiratory system and process of gaseous transport, then this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve comes into picture. This is one of the most fundamental parts of respiratory physiology, which explains us that how hemoglobin and oxygen source interaction. How beautifully this relationship is being organized so that the hemoglobin is loaded with oxygen in the lungs or in the pulmonary tissues, move in the blood or in the plasma, and then it reaches the tissues where there is utilization of oxygen is there after it gets unloaded from the hemoglobin. This beautiful relationship is explained by this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So with this brief introduction, let us start this lecture. In this lecture, I will show you two fundamental aspects, that why this curve is important. Number two, how this graph is being plotted. Number three, what are the modalities, and that modalities will come in my second part. So let us start with this word, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. This is also known as oxygen dissociation curve, and very common name in respiratory language, this is known as ODC, oxygen dissociation curve or oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Now my question to all of you, I told about oxygen, I told about hemoglobin, I told what is the loading of oxygen with hemoglobin, or I can say how much the hemoglobin is binding with oxygen, that's known as saturation or loading. Then why this word dissociation is? Why it is not association, oxygen hemoglobin association curve? That means the theory is something different, the practical is something different. The physiological basis of this curve is something different. Dissociation term indicates that the oxygen hemoglobin will show definite association, but at certain point of time they will dissociate from each other, so that the oxygen will become free, hemoglobin will become free, hemoglobin will remain in the blood circulation, and oxygen will diffuse into the cells. So that is the physiological basis of this curve. Now point is that how we can define this ODC in a common language so that everybody can get access or understand to the concept. The number one point, this is the physiological relationship. I can add here the word, this is a physiological relationship of hemoglobin with oxygen. This is one definition. Second, I can write another definition. It is a functional interplay between hemoglobin and oxygen. This is another definition. I can also say relationship between hemoglobin and and oxygen describing, this point is important, describing or indicating loading of oxygen, loading and unloading of oxygen. This is another aspect. I can also say the functional relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen, indicating, this is important, indicating oxygen delivery to the tissues. So there are variety of concepts, variety of discussions, but the common concept is that it is the physiological relationship between the hemoglobin and the oxygen. At the pulmonary level, when the oxygen diffuses, it is having a very high partial pressure that we will discuss in the next lecture. At this high partial pressure of oxygen, there is a very big affinity of hemoglobin and oxygen they exhibit, by virtue of which this oxygen get loaded into the hemoglobin. So these are all known as the definitions which are suggesting, but there is a technical definition is there. Rather, I can say scientific definition of oxygen dissociation curve. This is the graphic representation of, I can say another definition which is little bit more scientific, more relevant and more pinpointed towards the concept. That is, it is the graphic representation of percentage saturation of hemoglobin with partial pressure of oxygen, that is expressed in terms of mmHg. This is another scientific definition, little bit directly exhibiting the relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen. And here I am saying percentage saturation of hemoglobin, how much percentage is being saturated. And when I am saying it is milliliter of mercury, it means I am saying the partial pressure of oxygen. I can derive another point, the graphic representation of, and this is the final one, graphic representation of partial pressure of oxygen, which is expressed in terms of mmHg, with percentage saturation of hemoglobin. So this is another way of presentation, but all together all the definitions are interrelated. All the definitions say the common concept, but here technically saying we are having a biaxial curve. We will put where two axes will be there, one is y-axis, the next one is the x-axis. In the x-axis we will see the partial pressure of oxygen, which is expressed in terms of millimeter of mercury, and we will see the y-axis, which is expressed in terms of saturation of hemoglobin in percentage. We can also put y prime axis, where we can say what is the gram of hemoglobin saturated. So the various way, various authors they present. I can say a summary line, with increase in the partial pressure of oxygen, the percentage saturation of hemoglobin also increases. This is a tagline, and this tagline defines that if partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, both in arterial blood or in the venous blood, if it is rising, then the hemoglobin shows more and more saturation with oxygen. So if this concept is true, we should get a linear graph. That means what I am interested to say, now this point is very important for all of you to know. Suppose this is y-axis, this is x-axis. Here I am putting partial pressure of oxygen in mmHg. This is the x-axis. This is suppose the y-axis this side, and this is y-axis, and this is hemoglobin saturation, that is in percentage. If I will say that there is a rise in the partial pressure of oxygen, there will be rise in the percentage of saturation of hemoglobin, then the curve should be a straight line like this. But actually this curve is not a straight line, rather it's a sigmoid curve like this, an S-shaped curve showing a slow phase or a lag phase, then an exponential phase or log or the very fast phase, then another slow phase, and then almost a constancy phase, means there is not at all any increase is there. So why I am saying this? Because if we define it that it is the functional relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and percentage saturation of hemoglobin, and if partial pressure of oxygen is rising and percentage saturation of hemoglobin is rising, then why it is not a straight line? Or rather I will say, why it is a sigmoid curve? So this needs to be explained. So with this primary introduction is being over. This class is over. But our next lecture will there containing three major words. One is known as P50 value. Second, what do you mean by this sigmoid curve? Third, what do you mean by right-sided shift? Fourth, what do you mean by left-sided shift? And fifth, the clinical or the physiological significance of this oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. So next lecture, I am coming with these ideas, these information, so that this lecture will be completed. But for you, the take-home message is that oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve is the physiological representation of how the hemoglobin gets saturated with oxygen, why the oxygen binds with the hemoglobin, in what fashion it binds, then how hemoglobin carries the oxygen to the tissue level, and at the tissue level how the oxygen gets dissociated from the hemoglobin so that it will enter the cells and it will be utilized inside the cell. So there are fundamental questions: why it is loaded in the pulmonary level, why it is unloaded or dissociated at the tissue level. So we will have these words: loading means association or saturation, unloading means a dissociation. So these points we'll discuss. So stay tuned for my lecture 2, which will complete this oxygen dissociation curve. Thank you so much and have a wonderful time ahead. Thank you. We are meeting soon in the next class.